on writing that intro and conclusion. So let's start with the introduction, the beginning. I think this little comic strip helps to highlight how a lot of students feel about writing the introduction. I know so much that I don't know where to begin. That's often a common feeling with writing an introduction, is the question of how do I even start this paper? Where do I begin? So that's going to be part of the question that we address in today's slideshow. So think about your introduction as a row of dominoes. Everything should fall into place. So that first domino is your introduction, and it's setting off the rest of your paper. So how you start your introduction is going to be very important, because it's going to kind of set the tone and set the pace for the rest of the paper. So there are 4 elements that you should include in your introduction. So when you're writing your intro for this final paper, make sure you have these 4 elements. First of all, you want to have the hook the reader. Second is to provide background information or identify a problem. The third is to give the reader general knowledge of what the paper is about. And fourth is to lead into the thesis and key points. So I'm going to go through each one of these in more detail in just a moment. Let's start with writing the hook. So the very first sentence of your introduction is going to be very important. It's going to be that first sentence that draws the reader in. So your reader will become disinterested if your paper is not appealing right from the start. So you want to capture the reader's attention right as they enter into your paper. So crafting a really good first statement that hooks the reader, draws them in, is very important. So think about a movie or book that you either read or saw that really captured your attention right from the start. It had some kind of intriguing beginning that instantly drew you in and made you want to keep reading. So think about that when you're crafting a hook. How can you state a sentence in such a way that it will draw your reader in and make them want to continue to read your paper? There are things that you want to avoid, however, when writing your hook. So this very first sentence of your intro. First of all, you want to avoid starting with a question. These are all kind of cliche ways to begin your paper. And so you want to avoid these typical, maybe ways that you would have used in high school writing to hook your reader. So avoid starting with a question, avoid beginning with some quotation, some cliche or overused phrases, or funny informal start. So these are all things that you want to avoid when writing a hook. On the other hand, a good hook should draw the reader in. So you want to begin with a broad, interesting sentence that segues nicely into your argument. So begin with this kind of broad, sweeping statement. So something that your reader will be able to relate to, along the lines of, in today's society, we all experience this. Or in the church today, we've all had this kind of experience, or we know what this is like. Some broad statement like that the reader can relate to. That's a great way to hook them. So how do you do this? We'll begin by making a list of what's interesting about your topic. So you've had those 3 different topics that you could choose from for this final paper. So ask yourself what initially made you choose the topic that you chose. What was interesting to you about this topic? And make a list of what is interesting about it. Are there any current events going on that you could relate to this topic? Or imagine a hypothetical reader and devise an opening sentence that might appeal to them. So imagine who your reader will be, and then think up a sentence that would help you capture that individual's attention. – So with that in mind, I think if you're a particularly visual person, visualizing your introduction as an inverted triangle can be really helpful. So that opening sentence, this hook, is the broadest part of the triangle. So you're starting off with a sweeping statement, a broad idea. And then as you go through your introduction, you are slowly narrowing into your thesis statement. And that thesis statement is the point of the triangle. This is the narrowed in statement of what this paper is about. So while you're crafting your introduction, think about it in this visual format, in this visual form of an inverted triangle. That can be really helpful to imagine going from broad to narrow. Okay, so the second part of the introduction is to provide some kind of background information, or you could identify a problem. So let's look at these two options. The first option is you can let your reader know about the context of your research. So you can give brief overview information that pertains to your research that you're going to be doing. So some kind of interesting background context for your thesis statement, for your topic. Or another option is to identify a problem that you plan to solve in your paper. So in some way, your thesis statement is, to a certain degree, suggesting a solution to a problem that's been raised in your introduction. So either one of these methods can be very effective. Sometimes a problem can be a very interesting way to start your introduction because it shows that you're aware of an issue and that this paper is a response to that issue. So either one of these can be a great option. So if you decide to go with the background information, you need to ask yourself some questions to determine how much background information to include. Because you don't want a super long introduction, right? You want your introduction to be one paragraph, about a half a page in length, not too overwhelming. It should just be enough to introduce your topic. So you don't want to go on and on and on with all this background information. So it's important to ask yourself, how much information should you really include? So here's some good questions to ask yourself. First of all, is there a historical context that's important to understanding this topic? So if you think that there's some historical information that's pretty essential to even understanding the topic, then you might want to include that in your intro. Or are there any larger, better known issues that lead directly to this topic? Or are there any other statistics or significant details that would give the reader a better understanding of why this topic is important? So for example, if you were writing on megachurches today, use of megachurch today, providing some kind of statistic about how many megachurches there are, or when megachurches came about, when that started. Some kind of statistic or detail like that could be really helpful for setting up for your thesis statement. All right, if you decide to go with the problem, you can also ask yourself some questions to determine what the problem might be. So the first question you could ask yourself is there an issue with the current way of thinking with regards to X? So are you wanting to suggest that the current way we view something, there might be some issue with that, and you want to address that issue? And your thesis statement is an attempt to address that issue. You could ask yourself, is there controversy surrounding the issue of X? Or is there a possible better solution that I can provide to the problem of X? So these are all good questions to ask yourself if you want to determine a problem that you want to respond to in your introduction. All right, tip. If you're having trouble making up your mind whether to do background information or to do a problem, you could try writing both ways. Try doing both and choose which one sounds best. So if you can't make up your mind which to do, just try writing 2 different introductions and choose the one that you find best sets up your paper. All right, step number 3. So the third element of your introduction. This is general knowledge of what the paper is about. So now that you've established this background information, or you've addressed a problem, show how this ties into your question that you plan to address. So use this time to explain any jargon or concepts that are not common knowledge. So if you're going to be using certain language or key terms throughout your paper, this could be a good time to explain what those words mean. And use this general knowledge portion of your introduction to lead into your thesis statement. Because you don't want your thesis statement to kind of come out of the blue. You don't want it to be this jarring statement after you've been talking about a problem or given some background information. You want to lead into it. It needs to flow. So use this general knowledge to help flow into your thesis statement. And that's the fourth element. So that final element is to end your introduction by stating your thesis statement and its main points for the paper. So this is what we covered last week. So you already have a thesis statement crafted. So it's then making sure your introduction flows nicely into this thesis statement. Another tip. Your introduction should be all that the reader needs to summarize your paper. So by simply reading your introduction, the reader should know exactly what your paper is about. So I mentioned this last week when writing the thesis statement, that you shouldn't keep any secrets from your reader. You should be upfront and communicate everything they need to know in that introduction. The introduction should completely prepare them for what follows by either showing this is the problem that I've noticed and here's how I plan to respond to that problem, or here's some background information to help set up to this thesis statement that I'm going to address in this paper. So either way, your introduction should be setting up the reader for what comes. A good way to test to make sure that you have done this and that's clear in your introduction is ask somebody else to read your intro and see if they can guess what your paper will be about. See if just by reading their introduction, if they have a concept of what you're going to write about in your paper. All right, moving on to writing a conclusion. So once you've completed those elements of your introduction, you can move on to thinking about crafting your conclusion. So here is another kind of funny comic strip that maybe suggests how we often view a conclusion. And in conclusion, I restate my main points in a super wordy fashion to squeeze another paragraph out of this paper. So I think we often think about a conclusion in this way, that it's just a filler. You get to the end of writing your entire paper, you're tired of writing, and you don't really know how to end it, so you just squeeze another paragraph into the paper, maybe to try and hit that word limit. But a conclusion actually plays a very important role in the paper as a whole. And so we're going to explore what role that conclusion plays and how to craft it in the rest of the slideshow. So what is a conclusion? This is a quote from Ending the Essay Conclusion from the Harvard College Writing Center. And I think it does a great job summarizing the purpose of a conclusion. Quote, "A conclusion is your last chance to persuade your readers to your point of view. to impress yourself upon them as a writer and thinker. And the impression you create in your conclusion will shape the impression that stays with your readers after they've finished the essay. So I think this little quote helps to really capture the importance of a conclusion. It's really that last opportunity you have to talk to your reader, to show them the importance of this paper that you've crafted. And it's also important because it leaves a final impression. What you say at the end is going to stick with them the longest because it's going to be the last thing they read. So leaving a strong impression at the ending is really important. So a poor conclusion, we probably all can know what a poor conclusion looks like. If you've ever read a book or watched a movie in which you really enjoyed most of it until the very end, and then you felt very disappointed at the ending, you kind of know that letdown that a conclusion can have. You probably even walked away remembering what you didn't like about the ending rather than what you liked about the rest of the book or the movie. So really recognizing the impact and the impression a conclusion can have on your reader is very important. So on the flip side, a good conclusion should loop back to your introduction and complete your paper as a single thought. So a good conclusion isn't just a standalone paragraph, but it fits together. It's that final piece of the puzzle that you needed in order to loop your paper as one whole, to go back to your introduction and kind of create this one nice package or presentation. So I think if you're visual, this little diagram can be helpful. It kind of looks like a candy maybe or something, but it kind of gives you a visual representation of an entire paper. So like I showed earlier, your introduction, you've got this broad hook statement that you begin with that narrows into your thesis. And then you have the body, which is the argument, the core, the center of your paper, which is really describing and building an argument. And then you have a triangle at the end there, which is you've rephrased your thesis statements. You've gone back to that narrow point of restating a thesis, and then you've kind of gone broad again and left your reader with this kind of final thought that they can mull over. So if you think about a conclusion in this visual way, you can kind of see it's almost a mirror image of itself with the introduction. So think about that as we continue to talk about what a conclusion should include. So with that in mind, there are really three main elements to a conclusion. The rewording or restating of a thesis, summarizing and synthesizing the main points, and explaining what the reader should take away from the paper or the final thought. So I'm going to go through each one of these in detail, starting with rewording the thesis. Okay, so you want to begin your conclusion by rewording your thesis statement. You don't simply want to cut and paste your thesis from your intro into your conclusion, but you want to actually reword your thesis statement in a fresh manner. Why? In order to avoid sounding monotonous, and also to show that you understand your thesis so well that you're able to reword it and reconstruct it. So there are a couple ways to do this. You can substitute synonyms, you can reorder the sentence, or you can shorten the statement. Any one of these can help you to reword your thesis statement so you're not sounding monotonous or repetitive. So let me give you an example. So this is an excerpt from a student paper. And in the original is her original thesis statement, and then below is how she reworded it for her conclusion. So the original thesis statement in her introduction reads as follows. Therefore, in order to better comprehend the need for approaching missions with cultural intelligence, we will explore some of the unintentional negative effects of short-term missions on the communities missionaries believe that they are serving, psychologically, spiritually, economically, and physically. So notice in her original thesis, she states out her argument, followed by her main points. Now notice in her reworded thesis and her conclusion, she's actually just flipped that order. It reads as follows. By exploring the negative psychological, spiritual, economic, and physical effects of short-term missions, we see that it is vital for churches to approach short-term missions with cultural intelligence. So the content between the original and the reworded is exactly the same. The content hasn't changed at all. She's simply flipped the order and made a few slight adjustments and changes to the thesis statement in order to kind of give it a fresh feel, so it doesn't sound like this monotonous copy and paste from her introduction into her conclusion. So this is one example of how you can go about rewording your thesis statement. Tip: in your conclusion, avoid sounding apologetic. It can be a very common mistake in papers for students to try and apologize for not knowing as much as they feel like they should know. They can use phrases like, I'm not an expert, but, or this paper tried to show. These kind of phrases can make the paper sound almost apologetic and take away some of the credibility of what you're trying to communicate. So be firm in your conclusion. Be confident in the conclusion that you have reached, and avoid using phrases like I think, I believe, I tried, those kind of phrases in your conclusion. Be firm in that conclusion. All right, step number 2. So after you have reworded your thesis statement, the next element to your conclusion is to then summarize and synthesize your main points. So begin by including a brief summary of the main points of your paper. So go back through your introduction or your rough draft and look at each main point that you made and see if you can rephrase and break down each paragraph and summarize what was this paragraph about, what was this one idea, and briefly summarize that in your conclusion. So it's kind of a reminder to your reader, these are the points that we talked about, because by the time they get to the end of your paper, they may have kind of forgotten your first point or not realized how that first point really fit into the rest of the paper. So go back and summarize those points and explain, okay, remember this is the first point, this is my second, my third, and give a brief summary. Then you want to synthesize. So show how all of those points then fit together as a whole. So why were then each one of those points important? Why did you include each one of those? How did that fit together as a whole to solve the problem introduced in your thesis statement? So synthesizing is a very important part, to not just only summarize, but then explain how each of these then fit together. So this is a very important part of your conclusion. So how do you do this? Go back, review your outline and your rough draft, remind yourself of what your main points were. Reread all your topic sentences. Your topic sentences should clearly state what each paragraph is about. So just by going back and rereading your topic sentences, you should have a clue of what each paragraph attempted to address. And then combine these ideas into a coherent whole. So work on putting all those together so you have a coherent picture of your paper as a whole. All right, step number 3. So after you've reworded your thesis, you've summarized and synthesized your main points, now you want to leave your reader with a takeaway or final thought. This provides a sense of resolution and helps to wrap up any loose ends. So you can do this by using one of these methods. You can include an insight or quotation from the research or reading you did for your paper. So if there was something that was really insightful or an interesting quotation that you want to leave your reader with, that can be a good way to leave that final thought. Another option is to propose a course of action or a solution to an issue, or even address a question for further study. So leave your reader with some kind of final thing to mull over. Like, what is the next step? So now that we've addressed this problem, where do we go from here? Or what is then the solution? Or potentially, if there isn't a solution yet identified, maybe another question comes up out of your paper that you want to leave the reader so that they can continue to think about and continue mulling over. This goes back to week 1, where you all read about Booth, about the research community. So by ending your paper with proposing another question for more research or more study, this is kind of contributing to that research community. It's showing how, okay, I've contributed this portion, now somebody needs to come along and take it to the next step. You could also end your conclusion by pointing to the broader implications of your research. So think outside the box, think bigger at this point. Remember that image of the triangle. So you were narrow with rewording your thesis statement, and now you're ending your conclusion by being broad, leaving that reader with some final thought that takes them beyond your paper, makes them think to that next step. Traps to avoid when it comes to your conclusion. Avoid too much summarization. Do not get caught up rehashing your earlier arguments. So this often occurs in conclusions where the summaries go on, keep going and going, that you end up getting caught up in your earlier summary and actually just rephrasing earlier arguments. Your arguments, by the time you reach your conclusion, your arguments have been made. You're done. You've done everything you needed to prove your point or to make your argument. And so now you're just summarizing what you've already stated. So be careful not to get caught up rehashing your earlier arguments. Like your introduction, your conclusion shouldn't be this long, drawn-out paragraph. It shouldn't be 1-2 page paragraph. It should be about half a page. It doesn't need to be this long, lengthy paragraph. And this goes into the next element of not including new information. So you're not making any new arguments in your conclusion. All of your arguments have been made at this point. So you make sure not to turn your conclusion into another argument. This is simply a place for you to wrap up what has already been stated in the body. So then, just as a reminder for the conclusion outline, reword the thesis, summarize, synthesize main points, and explain what the reader should take away from the paper or the final thought. So those are the 3 important elements to writing conclusion. So now that you've